The gavel hadn't even settled before the tension ripped through the room. Judge Tanya Chutkan's voice cracked like a whip, slicing across the courtroom. "Counselor, that's enough." The interruption came swift, sharp, and absolute. Her hand lifted with the authority of someone who expected obedience without question. The silence that followed was chilling, almost suffocating, as every eye in the chamber shifted toward the woman she had just cut off. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't shuffle her papers, didn't give the judge the satisfaction of a retreat. Instead, she paused, just long enough for the weight of the interruption to settle in the air. The room had seen attorneys stumble before under Chutkan's iron grip, but this pause felt different, because Crockett was different. In that moment, she embodied every immigrant's child told to keep quiet, every young woman told her words carried less weight, every American whose dignity had been interrupted by power. Her calm stillness was not surrender. It was strategy. And yet, the arrogance of Chutkan's tone echoed. The authority in her eyes made clear she believed the matter was closed, her word final. The villain's confidence hung heavy in the air, daring anyone to challenge it. The cameras zoomed. Journalists scribbled notes. The audience inside and outside the courtroom felt the sting. A voice was being silenced. But Crockett's expression told another story, one not of defeat but of quiet defiance. She held her folder a little tighter, her lips pressing together in a line that signaled she had not spoken her last word. There was something she cared that the judge had not accounted for, something weightier than the interruption that had just landed. And when she finally spoke again, her tone was measured, steady, yet behind it hummed the electricity of revelation. She was not just about to continue an argument. She was about to introduce something that would turn the very foundation of this exchange upside down. The judge believed she had ended the moment, but Jasmine Crockett was only beginning. What she would reveal next left the courtroom stunned and the country leaning closer to its screens. Because sometimes the most powerful sound in a room full of authority is the voice that refuses to be silenced. And this time, that voice was armed with evidence. The interruption wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a collision between authority and defiance that spoke to something much larger. Because this wasn't any ordinary trial, and it wasn't any ordinary argument. The stakes in that room stretched far beyond the polish of the benches or the gleam of the microphones. What hung in the balance was a question as old as democracy itself. Who gets to speak, and who gets silenced? Judge Tanya Chutkan had built her reputation on control, tight, unyielding control. To her supporters, she was decisive. To her critics, she was domineering. Either way, when she raised her hand and clipped Jasmine Crockett's words short, she wasn't just ending an argument. She was flexing the authority of a system that too often assumes it can shut down truth with a single command. But the story didn't end with a gavel strike. It was only beginning. Because across from Chutkan stood a woman who had fought her whole life to be heard. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another attorney delivering points of law. She was a force, an elected leader, a relentless advocate, a voice sharpened by battles against injustice that many in that room had never endured. And so, the stakes multiplied. On one side, a judge determined to control the narrative. On the other, a woman unwilling to be reduced to silence. It wasn't just a legal exchange. It was a symbolic clash over whether power still belongs to authority alone, or whether dignity and truth can bend even the most unyielding command. Every pause grew heavier. Journalists typed furiously, sensing the confrontation wasn't just about procedure, but about principle. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens, reading the body language, waiting for the moment when Crockett would decide whether to fold or fight. But there was something else, something few yet realized. Crockett wasn't gambling on raw defiance. She wasn't preparing to shout over authority. She had something far more dangerous to the arrogance that confronted her, proof. It was still tucked inside her folder, resting silently under her hand. But Crockett knew the moment to reveal it was approaching. She knew that once it surfaced, the judge's interruption would no longer be remembered as a command that silenced her, but as a mistake that set the stage for her greatest strike. Because if power lies in who gets the last word, then Jasmine Crockett was holding a word that could not be dismissed. And as the minutes ticked on, the nation could feel it that electric tension, that sense that something was coming, something bigger than the interruption, something that would change the balance of the entire courtroom. What happened next didn't just challenge the judge's authority. It would expose it. And that's when the backstory of Tanya Chutkan, the authority figure who had just silenced her, came crashing into focus. To understand the weight of that interruption, you have to understand Tanya Chutkan. She wasn't just a judge in a black robe. She was a figure carved from the system itself, a woman who carried the authority of the bench like a weapon. Every strike of her gavel, every clipped command, had been sharpened through years of building a reputation as the one who would not bend. To some, this made her admirable. They called her tough, uncompromising, unshakable in the face of pressure. But to others, that same iron grip looked less like strength and more like arrogance, an eagerness to silence, a refusal to listen, a belief that once her voice entered the room, no other truly mattered. In this courtroom, that reputation loomed over every exchange. Attorneys had stumbled under a stare before, tripping over words, retreating into submission. Journalists had written about her abrupt interjections, her insistence that control belonged to her and her alone. And as she sliced into Jasmine Crockett's argument with that sudden, commanding interruption, it seemed like just another example of the Chutkan effect. Authority shutting the door before truth could even walk in. But here's the irony. Control can be a trap. When you wield it too often, too sharply, you start to believe it's unshakable. You start to believe that silencing someone is the same as defeating them. And that's where Chutkan underestimated the moment. Because in front of her sat not just another attorney to be managed, but a woman who thrived in the very spaces where voices were meant to be erased. Crockett had faced sharper interruptions than this in her life, and every one of them had forged her into someone who didn't back down when authority demanded obedience. Chutkan's command was meant to end the conversation, but instead, it set the stage for the confrontation that would define it. Because when authority overreaches, the silence that follows doesn't always last. Sometimes, it becomes the opening act for a truth too powerful to contain. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett was preparing to break the judge's illusion of control, piece by piece, word by word, long before Jasmine Crockett sat in that courtroom, holding her ground against the judge's interruption. She had already lived the story of someone who refused to be silenced. Her journey didn't begin in marble halls or under bright TV lights. It began in the neighborhoods where voices like hers were too often ignored, where power was rarely shared, and where dignity had to be fought for every single day. Crockett grew up watching people dismissed simply because they didn't fit the mold. She saw families who worked hard yet were treated as invisible. She saw young people spoken over, immigrants brushed aside, and women told their ambitions belonged in the background. And with each injustice she witnessed, something inside her hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. That resolve carried her into law, not as a careerist path, but as a calling. She didn't just want to argue cases. She wanted to argue for people. For those who couldn't hire high-priced attorneys, for those whose names never made the headlines, for those who had been told be quiet one too many times. And the thing about Jasmine Crockett, she never confused volume with strength. She understood that sometimes the most powerful stance wasn't shouting, but standing firm, waiting, letting arrogance spend itself before you answer with undeniable clarity. That's why her supporters admired her, not just for what she said, but for what she represented to them. Crockett was living proof that the American promise could still belong to those who started without privilege, who carried their communities on their shoulders, and who refused to bow when the system tried to push them down. By the time she walked into that courtroom, she carried more than a briefcase. She carried every lesson learned from being underestimated, every scar from being spoken over, every ounce of defiance inherited from those who came before her. She was not just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every immigrant child told her accent was too heavy, every woman told her ideas didn't matter, every ordinary citizen told the system was too big to fight. So when Judge Tanya Chutkan's interruption came crashing down, the story didn't unfold as it had for so many others. This time, the person on the receiving end wasn't someone who would falter. She was someone who had been preparing her entire life for moments exactly like this. And in her silence after the interruption, measured, steady, unbroken, There was more strength than in any shouted objection, because Jasmine Crockett knew she held something the judge could not control, the truth waiting inside that folder at her fingertips. And once it emerged, it wouldn't just change the room. It would shake the narrative far beyond those four walls. The silence after the interruption lingered like a storm cloud, thick and unrelenting. Judge Tanya Chutkan sat back in her chair, her expression carved in stone, radiating authority. To many in that courtroom, it looked like the moment was finished. The judge had spoken. The argument was over. But Jasmine Crockett's eyes told a different story. She leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in calm readiness, the way a seasoned fighter shifts their stance just before the counterstrike. Her pause wasn't hesitation. It was precision. Then, in a voice low but unwavering, she continued, not reckless, not rushed, but deliberate. She spoke as though every syllable was weighted, crafted to cut through the thick veil of authority that had just tried to silence her. Each word pushed back against the pressure in the room, reclaiming the ground she had been told was no longer hers. Chutkan's gavel tapped lightly, a warning more than a command. But the judge's usual tactic, flustering an opponent into retreat, wasn't working here. Instead, Crockett's composure seemed to absorb the interruption like water over stone, leaving her unshaken, her rhythm unbroken. And that was when the escalation became undeniable. The room itself seemed to shift. Reporters stopped typing for a moment, their pens hovering. Observers in the gallery leaned forward, sensing the confrontation was no longer about legal points alone. It had become a duel, a test of who could hold their ground under the crushing weight of authority. Chutkan raised her voice again, sharper this time, slicing into Crockett's argument. But Crockett didn't meet fire with fire. She let the judge's words hang in the air, absorbed them, and then pressed on with a steadiness that unsettled even the most seasoned court watchers. Her restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy, the patience of someone who knew her turn to strike was coming. Because beneath her calm delivery, a storm was gathering. The folder resting under her hand was no ordinary set of papers. It was a pivot point of the entire confrontation, the weapon she had been waiting to unleash. And while the judge believed her interruption had asserted dominance, Crockett knew it had only set the stage for the reveal to matter even more. The escalation had reached its peak. Authority on one side, defiance on the other, a judge certain of her control, and a woman holding the one thing that could shatter it. The air thickened, charged with anticipation. It was no longer a question of whether Crockett would respond. It was only a question of when. And when she finally reached into that folder, the courtroom would never be the same. The moment had ripened. Every second of silence, every clipped interruption, every flicker of tension had led here. Jasmine Crockett's hand slid across the table, deliberate, unhurried, as if she wanted the entire room to feel the weight of what she was about to do. The folder opened with a soft snap, but the sound landed louder than any gavel. She lifted the document, crisp and undeniable, and held it with the kind of steadiness that comes only from certainty. For a heartbeat, she didn't speak. She let the paper speak first, the sight of it alone sparking murmurs in the gallery, shifting reporters back into their frantic scribbles. Then her voice came, calm but charged. "Your Honor," she said, her words cutting through the heavy air. "This isn't speculation. This is fact." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Chutkan's composure faltered, just slightly, but enough for everyone to see. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, as though willing the document to disappear under sheer authority. But authority doesn't erase truth. And truth was now staring her down in black and white. Crockett read aloud, line by line, her voice unwavering. Each sentence landed like a strike, puncturing the silence, peeling away the veneer of control. What had seemed airtight just moments before began to crumble under the weight of documented proof. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. The press clattered on keyboards, and even the judge's gavel seemed powerless against the storm gathering in the room. Chutkan tried to cut in once more, but the force of the evidence was already moving faster than interruption could contain. For the first time, it wasn't Crockett who was on the defensive. It was the judge. And as Crockett placed the document down before her with finality, the message was clear. No amount of authority could silence what was written there. The tables had turned, and the cameras caught every flicker of the moment the courtroom realized it. What came next wouldn't just ripple through those walls. It would explode across the nation. The courtroom buzzed long after the words left Jasmine Crockett's lips. But outside those walls, the real shockwave began. Within minutes, clips of the moment flooded social media. Hashtags erupted across timelines, surging to the top of trending lists. Viewers replayed the clip over and over. The interruption, the silence, the document raised like a torch of truth. Twitter exploded with praise. "That's how you handle arrogance," one user wrote. Others posted side-by-side memes. The judge's interruption frozen next to Crockett's calm reveal, captioned "Power versus Truth." On Instagram, short edits layered dramatic music over the scene, turning it into instant internet legend. Commentators and politicians weighed in. Some applauded Crockett for standing firm, calling it a lesson in dignity under pressure. Others criticized Chutkan's heavy-handed style, questioning whether authority had crossed into arrogance. The debate spilled onto cable news, with clips looping on repeat, drawing millions into the moment. What struck people most wasn't just the evidence itself. It was the way it was delivered. Crockett hadn't shouted, hadn't matched arrogance with anger. She had waited. She had chosen her moment, and she had let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, she reminded the country that silence can be broken with precision, not chaos. The ripple was undeniable. What began as an interruption meant to suppress had become a viral symbol of resistance. And as the noise swelled across the nation, one truth grew louder than any gavel. Jasmine Crockett had changed the narrative. In the end, this clash was never just about a single argument or a single document. It was about something deeper, about whether power alone defines truth or whether truth can stand on its own, even in the face of authority. Jasmine Crockett proved that dignity is not weakness, that composure under pressure can be sharper than any interruption, that a single voice, when armed with fact and conviction, can turn the weight of arrogance into dust. The lesson reached far beyond the courtroom. It whispered to those who have been silenced at work, in classrooms, in their own communities, "You are not powerless. When your truth is solid, when your values are firm, no interruption can erase them." This was more than politics. It was a reminder that the American story belongs to those who stand tall, even when told to sit down. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the image remains. Judge Tanya Chutkan, hand raised in interruption, and Jasmine Crockett, document in hand, turning the tables instantly. That moment wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a declaration that truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. At Argument Arena, we tell these stories because they matter. They reveal the cracks in unchecked authority, and they spotlight the courage of those who refuse to bow to it. Crockett's stand wasn't just for herself. It was for every voice told to wait their turn, every truth forced into the shadows. And here's the challenge to you. Don't let this be just another clip you scroll past. Share it, discuss it, carry the lesson with you. Because when moments like this spread, they do more than entertain, they empower. They remind us all that dignity is strength, that patience can be power, and that truth will always find a way to the surface. So if you believe in voices that can't be silenced, join us. Subscribe, share, and stay with us here at Argument Arena. Together, we'll keep shining a light on the stories that prove one simple fact. Arrogance falls, but truth endures.